Violet was 28 when that day began like any other. An alarm clock at 6:10, the smell of over-roasted coffee rising from the kitchen, and the distinctive creaking of the wooden hallway that always sounded under the third floorboard, the one her father promised to fix when winter is over, but never got around to. After his sudden death, a silent heart attack in the middle of the afternoon, sandwiched between a bag of screws and an old radio, the house ceased to be a home and became a demanding organism, demanding bills, new light fixtures, furnace filters, mortgage payments, patience. Violet, who worked at a tech company with a small but demanding team, had years earlier rejected a transfer to Seattle with subsidized housing. She stayed to be with her mother's viscous mourning, a mourning that clung to the curtains and their conversations. She learned to distinguish the refrigerator's hum from a water leak, to call the bank when the system failed, to read the tiny print on the furnace. Insurance. Over time, the neighborhood recognized her by her gray backpack with a mountain patch and her habit of paying cash for bags of snow salt. She did all this without ceremony, like someone sweeping up crumbs before someone points out there are crumbs. The mother, on the other hand, survived on broken routines and memories she knew how to arrange like a discreet altar. Her husband's blue mug, untouched on the shelf, the brown coat hanging behind the door even though no one was using it. The hardware store calendar, frozen in the month of the heart attack. Sometimes it seemed she cared more for those reliquaries than for the daughter who held the roof in place. And it wasn't just a distraction from her grief. There was old, visible favoritism with a name and profile picture. Josie, the youngest daughter with a catalogue smile, stories of restaurants with white tablecloths, occupied the luminous center of every family anecdote, even when absent. Violet was the useful shadow, the one who called the gas fitter, the one who knew when the tax was due, the one who bought a pine bookcase with her first bonus and sanded it until her hands smelled like a workshop. 5 years of this either temper or break. In Violet, they tempered a rare calm, the kind that keeps a notebook with numbers and a manila folder from human resources in the bottom drawer, just in case one day she decides to stop being invisible. During that time, her mother's every gesture reinforced the feeling that Violet was the tolerated occupant, never the acknowledged daughter. If Josie called to say she'd been to a new restaurant, her mother would repeat it for days with a twinkle in her eye. If Violet announced she'd paid for the roof repair or gotten a bonus at work, she received little more than a dry murmur of approval, like someone grateful that the microwave works. This constant disproportionateness began to sink in. Violet began to measure the passage of time not in seasons, but in bills. Gas, mortgage, electricity, insurance on her mother's car. So, year after year, she grew silently older inside a house that was no longer hers, and yet she endured, because deep down there was still the hope that one day she would be seen. Everything came crashing down one warm Sunday morning when the smell of reheated coffee mingled with the hum of the refrigerator. Her mother appeared in the kitchen with an announcement on her lips that sounded not like a consultation, but like a decree. Josie and Brent are coming home. They've lost their jobs, and their rent is behind. They'll be staying here until they can get back on their feet. Violet tried to smile politely, but it never quite worked. The punchline came in a dry voice without pause, like someone giving a logistical order. They'll take your room. You can go to the guest room, or see what other option you can find. That last phrase, other option, was the equivalent of an invisible kick. It was the exact moment when invisibility transformed into expulsion, disguised as an option. That night, Violet lay in the bed that had so often sustained her sleepless nights. The ceiling showed cracks like dried veins, and the lamp flickered as irregularly as ever, reminding her that the switch still needed to be changed. But what weighed most heavily wasn't the house's imperfections, but the certainty that there was no longer a place for her there. She felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at having been reduced to an interchangeable part after years of supporting everything. Sadness at confirming what she had always known deep down, that her mother would never put her on the same level as Josie. As she listened to the creaking of footsteps in the hallway, she realized that something had irreversibly changed. It was then that she remembered the manila folder tucked away in the bottom drawer of her desk, between old manuals and tax receipts. That envelope contained the offer from Human Resources, a corporate apartment, small but her own, with subsidized rent and ready to move in at her request. For years, she had considered it a betrayal to have it there, as if accepting the possibility of using it would have meant abandoning her mother to the elements. Now she looked at it differently. It wasn't a betrayal, it was a lifeline. She stood up, took it in her hands, and stroked the seal of the corporate housing department. For the first time in a long time, she felt she had a way out, an alternative that didn't depend on anyone else. The next day, during her lunch break, Violet carried the manila folder to the company cafeteria. The murmur of conversations and the clatter of cups couldn't cover the trembling in her hands as she dialed the Human Resources department. The call was brief. The apartment was still available, and all she had to do was confirm the move-in date. The friendly voice on the other end of the line sounded like a safe passage. When she hung up, she took a deep breath, as if she'd been holding it for years. In that instant, she knew she wasn't trapped anymore. She had a concrete way out, a place to start over. The following days became a silent choreography of preparation. Violet walked around the house with a fresh gaze, sizing up each object as if she wanted to record its place before removing it. She touched the headboard of the bed, the spines of the books she'd underlined, the dining room chairs she'd paid for in installments, and with each a gesture she confirmed a decision. None of it would be left behind. What she'd brought with her would go with her. She began making lists on loose paper, organizing boxes in the basement, and discreetly packing clothes into suitcases. As her mother spoke excitedly of Josie's fresh start, Violet nodded silently, knowing that the real fresh start would be hers. Saturday dawned with a grey sky and a cold air that foretold rain, as if the weather wanted to accompany what was about to happen. Violet got up early, before her mother had turned on the coffee maker, and went out to pick up the moving van she had secretly reserved. The sound of the engine pulling up in front of the house was the first indication that something out of the ordinary was happening. Wearing work gloves and with calm determination, she began by dismantling the bed. Each screw, which she kept in a small plastic bag, felt like a closure, a kind of end to a chapter. Next, she took down the bookshelf piece by piece, carefully wrapped the plates, and placed the glasses in boxes marked with a black marker. The house began to show visible wounds, rectangular stains on the walls where furniture had been, circles of dust on the floor that revealed the silhouette of what was disappearing. The living room lost its warmth when the sofa was removed, the dining room table left a strange emptiness, and the kitchen was unrecognizable without the utensils and pots she had bought over the years. Violet worked with precision without pause, while her mother watched silently, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Each taped box was more than a move. It was a physical reminder of who had kept that home going. As evening fell, the echo in the rooms became undeniable. The dining room, once home to quiet dinners, redolent of reheated food, was now bare. Only the mark on the floor remained where the table legs had rested. In the living room, the clearer outline on the wall betrayed the spot where the television stand had been, and in the kitchen, the drawers looked like empty caverns after utensils, cutlery, and cups had been removed. The air was thick with dust and an uncomfortable silence that clung to her skin. Violet felt that every object that left the door was a truth that could no longer be hidden. This house didn't belong to her mother or Josie, but to her who had kept it alive with every bill paid. The mother finally couldn't take it anymore. Leaning against the living room, a doorframe, her voice cracked between reproach and bewilderment. "What are you doing? Why are you leaving everything empty?" Violet looked at her with a calmness that surprised even her. For years, she had waited for an opportunity to explain the invisible, and now she didn't need a speech. The bare walls spoke volumes. The mother, unable to process the situation, began accusing her of destroying the house and making it impossible for Josie, as if the furniture were a family gift and not the silent fruit of her own labor. Violet, without responding, taped another box shut and dragged it toward the truck. That gesture was more powerful than any words. When Josie arrived with Brent at dusk, carrying designer suitcases that looked out of place amid the dust, the impact was immediate. They expected to find a home ready to welcome them, its comfort intact, but instead found a stripped-down space, reduced to bare walls and cold echoes. Josie froze in the doorway, her mouth ajar, while Brent snorted in annoyance. His mother, who until then had remained resignedly silent, exploded into a frenzy, accusing Violet of having dismantled the house as an act of personal betrayal. In reality, what she had done was simply take what was hers, what she had bought and supported with her salary for years. Josie, in that high-pitched voice she always used when she wanted to impose authority, was the first to attack her. "You had no right. How are we supposed to live here now?" Brent, at her side, shook his head as if he too were the victim of an injustice, while her mother raised her voice, reproaching Violet for not having a heart and not thinking about the family. But Violet didn't get caught up in the verbal storm. Her serenity contrasted with the chaos. She observed the scene with a new clarity, as if a veil had finally been lifted from her eyes. What no one understood yet was that that empty house was the exact mirror of what their family dynamic had always been, a shell sustained only by her. It was then that Violet, without raising her voice, took a folded envelope out of her purse. She placed it on the kitchen table, the only piece of furniture left standing, and slid it into the middle. Inside were carefully filed receipts with clear dates and amounts, each with the bank transfer in Violet's name. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical. The mother opened it with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the numbers and the bank seal, and her face grew bitter, incredulous. The whole myth of the supposed insurance money that held the mortgage together crumbled in front of a stamped piece of paper. Violet spoke calmly, but each word cut through the air like a scalpel. "There was no insurance. I've been paying for this house for the last 4 years. While you were talking about sacrifice, I was the only one making it." The mother took a step back, searching for words that didn't appear, and Josie reacted furiously. Between screams, she confessed what she had hidden for so long. She had returned because she was drowning in debt with maxed-out credit cards and impossible to pay rent. Brent, unable to hold her gaze, lowered his head, muttering empty excuses. The perfect image of the golden daughter was cracking in seconds, revealing what it had always been, a facade sustained by lies and appearances. The house of cards was falling into plain sight, and Violet, for the first time, was not the invisible shadow, but the only one. With proof, the only one who had put real numbers on the table. As the accusations swung around the room, her mother blaming Josie, Josie reproaching her mother, Brent trying to fade into the shadows, Violet stood, almost like a spectator in a play that no longer belonged to her. She opened the envelope again and took out the most recent mortgage receipt. She placed it on the counter with a firm, final gesture. The still fresh ink showed the amount paid just a few days earlier. "The loan is still in your name," she said calmly, looking at her mother. 6 years to go. I won't pay another cent." No one responded immediately. The weight of the sentence was so dense that it seemed to have filled every empty corner of the house. Josie opened her mouth, but all that came out was a stutter that soon turned to silence. For the first time in a long time, the mother couldn't find an argument or a hurtful phrase to say in return. Brent ran a hand down the back of his neck, uncomfortable, as if looking for the exit from a room without doors. And in that moment, Violet felt a strange relief. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to cry. That piece of paper on the table was enough to make it clear that her role as provider ended there. She turned, took the keys to her new apartment from her pocket, and without looking back, walked toward the door. Each step resonated like a definitive closure, like the echo of someone who had finally decided to let go of the burden. The night air hit her face as soon as she crossed the threshold, and for the first time in years, she breathed without feeling like she was carrying an invisible burden on her shoulders. The moving van was ready, its boxes stacked silently as witnesses to the most decisive decision she had ever made. Her mother remained petrified in the empty living room. Josie held the phone as if seeking help for a call that wouldn't come, and Brent barely moved, unable to face the collapse of his own plans. Violet closed the door gently, without slamming it, because she no longer needed drama. The act of leaving was enough to make it clear that the story had changed. As she settled into the driver's seat, she placed her hands on the steering wheel and let a slight tremor escape her body. It was a mixture of fear and relief, vertigo and freedom. She thought about everything she was leaving behind, reproaches, favoritism, invisibility, and also about what she was gaining, her own space, silence, dignity. She looked one last time at the front of the house and started the engine. If you made it this far in the story, share it with someone who needs it, because sometimes true strength isn't found in holding on, but in letting go. With that reflection in mind, Violet started the truck and disappeared down the dark street toward her new beginning. The fall was faster than anyone could have imagined. Without Violet to cover the bills, the house became an impossible burden to bear. Letters from the bank began to arrive with alarming frequency. First reminders, then more severe warnings. The mother tried to appear normal, but every time she opened an envelope, her face twisted with helplessness. Josie, far from contributing, complained of the cold because the heat could no longer be turned on as regularly, or of the neighbors' noise when the cable service was cut off. Brent spent hours on the makeshift couch, looking for jobs he never got, taking refuge in excuses no one believed. What had once been a house kept quiet had now become a field of tension, where every corner was a reminder of what they had lost. The overdue mortgage ultimately dictated the final verdict. Unable to sustain it, they were forced to put the house up for sale. No buyers were willing to pay what it was worth, so they accepted a low, almost humiliating offer in a rush to avoid foreclosure. Moving day was a spectacle of frustration. Josie cried because she couldn't take all her dresses. Her mother clung to the walls as if she could still stop the inevitable, and Brent simply carried boxes with a frown, as if he were the victim of a cruel fate. They ended up settling into a cramped one-room apartment with thin walls that let in every noise from the neighborhood. The illusion of superiority they had so cultivated had been reduced to the harshness of survival. In contrast, Violet discovered in her new apartment a silence that didn't weigh her down, but rather caressed her. It wasn't large or luxurious. Living room with windows overlooking the street, a compact kitchen, and a bedroom barely big enough for her bed and the bookshelf she'd built with her own hands. But everything there belonged to her. She could leave the dishes in the sink without hearing reproaches. She could read until dawn, without anyone turning off the light behind her. She could walk barefoot on the cold floor without feeling like she was invading someone else's space. Every small, everyday gesture became a symbol of independence. The first night she slept there, amidst the clean echo of the new walls, she knew she had finally found a place where no one made her feel out of place. As the days passed, she began to enjoy a different routine. Coming home from work and opening the apartment door was like opening the door to her own world, without ghosts, without comparisons. She lit scented candles, prepared simple dinners, arranged her books on the bookshelf, and for the first time, everything seemed to respond. Only to her. It was as if each object spoke a personal language. You're in charge here, you're not invisible here. Even her alarm clock sounded different in the morning, not as a reminder of endless duties, but as an invitation to build something of her own. In a short time, the fatigue she'd carried for years transformed into energy, into a new calm that began to show on her face. The change didn't go unnoticed at the office. Her colleagues noticed that she no longer arrived with deep, dark circles under her eyes, or with the lackluster air of someone carrying an invisible battle at home. Violet began participating more in meetings, contributing ideas she'd previously kept to herself. When someone asked for her help, she was available, but no longer with the urgency of someone seeking approval, but with the calm confidence of someone who knows her own worth. This difference was contagious. Her team began to see her as a role model, someone who supported without imposing, who knew when to intervene and when to give way. Little by little, her name began circulating in hallway conversations and emails from managers. The real turning point came when a position opened for a team leader in her area. Once upon a time, Violet would have hesitated, convinced herself she wasn't up to the task, just as her mother had told her all her life. But now the decision was clear. She submitted her application with a solid portfolio and a short, to-the-point letter summarizing her accomplishments. The interview wasn't an interrogation, but rather a confirmation of what everyone already saw. Weeks later, she received the news. The position was hers. She didn't celebrate with fanfare or photos on social media. She simply lit a candle in her apartment and toasted herself with a glass of cheap wine, knowing that this victory was the sole fruit of her perseverance. As the months passed, Violet realized she no longer expected calls from her mother or messages from Josie. The few that arrived were laced with veiled reproaches or attempts at manipulation, reminding her that family comes first, or that she needed to forgive. But those messages no longer held a sharp edge. It was like reading sentences in a language that no longer belonged to her. Every time she recalled the image of the empty house with the rectangles of dust where her furniture had been, she understood that this was her true liberation. She didn't need to scream or take revenge, simply withdrawing. Her presence was enough for the truth to be revealed. That image was enough to remind her that the invisible had finally become visible. Closure came simply, almost without ceremony. One autumn day, as she looked out her apartment window at the leaves piling up on the sidewalk, Violet realized she didn't need reconciliations or apologies that would never come. Her peace didn't depend on her mother acknowledging anything or on Josie changing. Her peace depended solely on staying true to her decision to leave. In that moment, as she held a warm cup of tea in her hands, she accepted that she was no longer the invisible daughter. She was now the owner of her time, her space, and her story. And that certainty was enough to bring things full circle. The following years solidified what that night had begun. Violet never set foot in the old house again, which was eventually sold to strangers. She learned from others that her mother worked long hours at a dental office, that Josie ran a neighborhood bakery, and that Brent bounced from job to job without direction. These were rumors that reached her like distant echoes, with no real weight in her life. Violet felt no resentment, only distance. What would have previously made her cry now seemed inevitable. Everyone lived with the consequences of their choices. She had chosen to let go, and that decision continued to sustain everything that came after. Along his own path, life was filled with discreet but steady achievements. The stability of his team leader position, short trips he'd previously forbidden, and new friendships born of affinities rather than obligations. Every morning as he left his apartment, he felt that the history he was carrying was no longer a burden, but a reminder of how far he'd come. If someone had told him at 28 that freedom would come in the form of moving boxes and empty walls, he might not have believed it. But it did, and every time he looks at the final mortgage payment he never paid. Again, he keeps a silent smile. That was the document that sealed not only the end of a cycle, but the beginning of his true life.